Hello, class. Hope this message finds you happy, healthy, safe, and sound. Today, we're going to talk about interest groups and lobbyists. And before you start yawning, I will let you know that this lecture is probably the best time you could ever hear it because there's no bigger interest group in the world, and you could argue almost in the history of the world than the Black Lives Matter movement is right now. And they're an interest group, but they're also a movement. So we're going to talk about that and a lot of other stuff. So let's jump in. What is an interest group? I'll give you a formal definition and then make it in plain English for you. So, interest group is a formal organization that is comprised of people who want to change or affect the law. So it's a formal organization, a group of people that are trying to band together for the common purpose of changing or potentially keeping the law the same. But there's something that has to be in our definition. It's a formal group, so it's not. It could start as a Facebook page, but at some point you're writing to the IRS and you're getting tax exempt status and you're starting to fundraise and you're starting to hire lobbyists, you're starting to do things to actually get what you need for your organization. Like if it's Black Lives Matter, racial justice, right? So interest groups, formal organizations, they could start as just a bunch of people talking about an issue that they really care about, and then it could blossom, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. There are great interest groups like that in Black Lives Matter, and then there are, interest groups that or lobbyists that give, to be honest, the system sort of a bad name. Um, you may have seen like "Thank You for Smoking" is a movie you could go see that kind of is like a sarcastic take on. That's pretty deep cutting take on lobbyists and interest groups, and there are people and lobbyists that try to keep the laws the same, like in regards to the smoking age, and wanted to keep it at 18 so they could continue to make money. But that's like everything in politics, right? There's going to be groups or things that you agree with and things you don't. So my job isn't to tell you what interest groups are great. Besides Black Lives Matter, my job isn't to tell you all the other ones that are great. My job is to tell you, what they are, and you can decide if you support them or not. And so here's where we get into some of the big, probably most divisive interest groups. The NRA. So if you've ever heard of the NRA, if you've never heard of the NRA is the National Rifle Association. The National Rifle Association is so now we're giving examples of interest groups. The first one we gave was Black Lives Matter, which we'll come back to. And the second one is the NRA. So the NRA, these have nothing to do with each other necessarily. And I say necessarily because if you know the Philando Castile case, you might understand that there could be potentially a connection. But the NRA is taking on the issue and has taken on the issue of gun ownership, and it's pretty simple. The NRA's basic platform, or what their basic belief is that the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, and so they believe in what I would say is an unfettered access to the Second Amendment. Fetter means to bind or to tie. So if you're unfettered, you're unbound, you have unlimited access to guns and potentially bullets and magazines and rounds, etc. Um, there are people that are in the NRA that don't believe in machine gun access for the average citizen, but that just want to make sure that the government doesn't take away their right. There are all types of people that are in the NRA, but there's one thing in common. They all agree at the baseline, point blank, no matter what, that the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms, should not be infringed upon. And they're very motivated, and they're very effective. Whether you like them or not is kind of irrelevant to this conversation. They're very, very effective. So What I mean is they're able to lobby the government, which we're going to talk about in a minute. They're able to get in with the government in conversations about law and have their voice heard and their voice actually reflected in the law that comes out. So that's a powerful organization when you're doing that. That now back to Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter right now is going to be driving the conversation in this country and in the world. And I can say that based on just you all know how much I love soccer. Got a jersey on here. You know how much I love. They call it the beautiful game, football. And in England, for example, right now, just to show you how big an interest group can get, that it can turn into a movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. In England, in the Premier League, which is like the NBA, essentially like all the great players from around the world play there. And there are other good leagues as well, but that one, every single player on every single team on every single jersey has on the back of their jersey, instead of their name, Black Lives Matter. Right now, in empty stadiums, but games that, man, these games are huge games, right? They matter to these teams and their supporters, and millions of people are watching it from home and seeing before the game players, coaches, referees, everybody, all the few people allowed in the stadium kneeling, silence, respect, solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. This is happening in the English Premier League right now. So why do I say this? Because it shows you that interest groups are powerful and that their message can be powerful, and that it can be go outside of just American politics. This is a global movement now. I don't know if you knew that it was that big. You may, and some of you probably know other encouraging stories like that from other countries. You know, looking at this interest group that we're talking about, Black Lives Matter, as more than just an interest group, as a movement, a global movement for racial justice and equality. So not all interest groups are that big, though. You're going to have other ones like a third example would be Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MADD, MAD. Mothers Against Drunk Driving is started in some sense in a similar way to the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a really sad group to be a part of, in the sense of you don't want to be a grieving parent who's lost their child, and that's how you meet other grieving parents. You'd rather just no one's grieving at all. But the good news is that in this pain, you know, just like the Black Lives Matter movement, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, they take the pain and they try to make change. And if you're between ages 18 and 20, you're not going to like this change maybe, but they're largely responsible for having the drinking age throughout all 50 states change from age of 18 to 21. And that's because, in part, they were able to prove scientifically that, and they weren't able to, but they presented the evidence that proved that the human being isn't fully developed at 18 in terms of their brain and other functions. So they may not make the wiser decision that they would at 21 about having a designated driver or just walking home or whatever the case is. So that's another interest group. I will say this about Mothers Against Drunk Driving is probably one of the most powerful and long-lasting groups. I mean, they used to have crashed, really, truly drunk driving cars that were crashed, and they would put them on campuses. You may have seen this around the country, and just to sort of get awareness and show, you know, hey, this is the potential of what could happen, you know, if you're drinking and driving. And that's a big deal, right? Okay, so interest groups so far, we have Black Lives Matter, we have NRA, and we have this one. And then there are other interest groups that concern completely different stuff. So you have interest groups like NARAL, which is it's an abortion rights group. And then you have groups that like focus on the family, that are pro life groups, and they're just basically on the other ends of the argument, right? And then you have groups, environmental groups. You have um, any issue that you can literally think of. there will be an interest group for that issue. Now, that interest group is probably not all of them are probably going to be as effective and as famous as Black Lives Matter. But there you can start an interest group for essentially anything, and the idea is you're finding people with the same goal as you, which is to change this thing. So another good example would be like the NAACP. You might say, well, how is the NAACP different than Black Lives Matter? It is different. NAACP stands for the National Association for what we would call today persons of color. And so the NAACP is an organization that has existed for a lot longer than Black Lives Matter, but is a more general group in terms of focusing on civil rights for people of color. So civil rights for people of color is the focus of the NAACP, and this organization has been around for so long and has been so effective in getting to the table. When I say getting to the table, I mean getting in the room with government officials and having a conversation that convinces them to change the law, just like MAD and just like the NRA and just like Black Lives Matter. Those are the groups are the ones that are effective when. And so let's get into that, and we'll come to some more examples of interest groups. But you name the issue just about, and there are interest groups like GLAD. I'm just sort of giving you off the top of my head. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. There's just, you name the issue, there's a group for it. And so how do these groups, this is the next question we're asking, now that we know what they are and essentially what they're about, they all really are taking on like one major issue, right? They're not taking on like gun rights and global warming, right? They're focusing. So you could put this as sort of a final note there in your definition of an interest group. They're almost always single issue, just because that's the way you're able to do more if you focus all your energy on one thing, one project. Okay, so what interest groups do to actually get what they want? No, this is number 2 definition here is lobbyists. They hire a lobbyist, and a lobbyist is the representative of the interest group, the legal representative, the face of the interest group, the spokesperson of the interest group. They're usually a lawyer. They might go into politics, or they might have just come out of politics, because if they just came out, they understand how the system works. And if they're about to go in, they'll then know how it worked from the outside. So they're actually, one thing that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders agree on is to ban lobbyists from becoming politicians and ban politicians from becoming lobbyists. Did you know they agreed on something? That's crazy, right? Um, so lobbyists are the people, and they're not all bad, right? But they're people that have access to government officials. Not always. It depends on how popular their interest group is and how much the people of the country care about the issue. If no one cares, they're not gonna invite you to their office. If you're in Black Lives Matter and people care, you're at the front seat, and that's just how. Remember we talked about, that's the beauty of public opinion, is if people are rising up in the streets and saying we demand something different, then the government has to listen to that movement, that Black Lives Matter movement. They have to listen, or they're just going to get voted out. It's just that simple. So lobbyists know that. And so here's some things that lobbyists can do in order to get what they want on behalf of the interest group. So in no particular order, number 1, you could say they could go on TV, they could go on social media, and they do. And number 2, they will go on these places and they'll expose or endorse a candidate's voting record. So they'll say, if they're in favor of Black Lives Matter and they're arguably, they'll say, not in favor of Trump, they could say, well, he said this and these racial things, and he just tweeted this, and and they can make their assessment, right? So for interest groups, it's really important that they go on TV, social media, lobbyists go on TV, internet, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, everything, And then as they go on, they are almost always going to endorse a candidate, because if these groups are big enough, the candidates are really going to want their support. Or in the case of like the NRA, this is so funny. I love this. It makes me laugh every time. If you watch a Republican debate, just all Republicans, and they're talking about the NRA, every person on the stage will brag about they got the highest grade from the NRA. I got an A. Well, I got an A plus. And if you watch a Democratic debate, all the Democrats are going to be like, well, I got a D. Yeah, well, I got a D minus. No, I got an F from the NRA. Literally. So exposing a politician's voting record, when I say exposing, you and I could go look it up, but nobody does that. So they just go on TV and just tell you, oh, they voted this way. And you're like, oh, I didn't know that. Right. And so those two things in combination are huge. And you can go on TV and not endorse a candidate. It doesn't have to be for that reason, but that's in some cases a connected. So number 3, what else do lobbyists do? At some point, you might say, why are they going on TV? Don't they want to change the law? Yeah, because if you go on TV and you convince the public, then the public can pressure politicians for you by demonstrating in the streets, as we've seen, right? So it's not a waste of time to go on TV and to go on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. It's not at all. It's brilliant nowadays, especially because you're going straight to the people. Then they can pressure the politicians. But what if for number 3, we want to actually pressure the politicians directly and say, you know what, Black Lives Matter, let's change the law. Here's the things we can't do anymore. Police cannot do this, this, and this, right? So number 3, at some point, a lobbyist is going to want to actually meet with government officials. So what you would hope for would be a formal meeting, meaning that you're going into their office. And just so you know, when you're a lobbyist, you have to be registered with Congress. So there's a list of everyone who's like official legal, lobbyists. And that's a good thing to know, so that we don't have the other thing I was about to say, which would be informal contact, where a lobbyist goes and meets with a congressperson or something, and it's at Starbucks or just someone's home, and now it's not formal anymore, and maybe there's some things that could happen. And I hope this never makes the list in real life, but we know it has to make the list because it happens, is bribes, right? And there are lobbyists who do this. I'm going to post a video for you of just a short interview with Jack Abramoff, who's a lobbyist who ended up going to prison. And he gives in a 10 to 12 minute interview, he basically breaks down what he says is how easy it is to buy a congressperson. Okay. So that's what, if you're a lobbyist, shame on you for doing that, right? He said he was going to write an idiot's guide for buying a congressperson or something like that. But then in the same interview, he's saying, only reason I'm saying all this in the interview is because of how sorry I am for what I did. So you guys can judge for yourself. But not every lobbyist goes to prison and does those things, because a lobbyist that's up above board is going to say, no, let's not meet there. Let's make it official. Let's do it the right way. Totally ethical. You're not going to, promise to get your kid into Harvard Law School. I'm not going to give you money for a yacht. We're just going to do it the right way, right? So you can put bribes on your list. There are lobbyists who would do that. Jack Abramoff got caught, but not. It's not fair to say that that's everybody, right? Okay, so another thing that lobbyists can do to get what they want for their interest group is to, if they can get lucky enough, to get a hearing with Congress. So you're not going to probably ever really get a hearing in front of all 100 senators, right? Or in front of all 435 House members. That's almost, probably you can say, almost never going to happen. So you're going to get maybe a committee. So say if it's for Mothers Against Drunk Driving, you would want maybe the Transportation Committee, right? Now, I don't know if you all knew this, but the way that the drinking age was changed wasn't that the federal government passed a law saying all states have to make it 21. They didn't actually do that. So how did every state end up choosing the age 21? All states don't agree that the sky is blue. Well, here's how they agreed. Because the federal government said, fine, we won't make a law about it because that's up to the states, but technically. But if the states keep it at anything under 21, we won't give them the money for transportation that they're due to get this year. So the billions and billions of dollars for new roads and bridges and everything, they're not going to get unless they make the drinking age 21. That's a nice way of doing it, right? You're just coercing them through basically saying you're not getting your allowance, right? So that's a fascinating thing all in and of itself. Lobbyists would love to hear from, or love to get in front of all of Congress, all 135 or all 100 people in the Senate. They're not going to get that, so they'll get a committee, and if they're lucky, right, and